Good afternoon. My name is Rafael Cesar. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at NYU. On behalf of the director, Jordana Mendelsohn, and associate director, Laura Turegano of the King Juan Carlos Center, I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's event, Decentering the Archive, Black Bodies in Performance and Translation in Iberia and the Iberian Atlantic World. This event is co-sponsored by the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. This roundtable discussion forms part of this year's programs for El Taller at KJCC, a new initiative that sets out to build connections among faculty and students in peninsular studies, especially those in the tri-state area, but not limited by geography, institution, or rank. This year, one of the benefits of our programs going online is that we are able to expand our efforts to include many more colleagues. Like so many of you, the contributors to our roundtable span different geographies, languages, and time zones. Our first speaker today is Meira Goldberg, who is a flamenco dancer, teacher, choreographer, and scholar. She's the author of Sonidos Negros on the Blackness of Flamenco, out in 2019, which won the 2020 Barnard Hewitt Award. Next, we'll have Larissa Brewer-García, who teaches at the University of Chicago and is the author of Beyond Babel, Translations of Blackness in Colonial Peru and New Granada from 2020. And then our last speaker will be Jeffrey Coleman, who teaches at Marquette University and is the author of The Necropolitical Theater, Race and Immigration on the Contemporary Spanish Stage, out in 2020. Our moderator is Eva Woods-Peron from Vassar College, who is the author of White Gypsies, Race and Stardom in Spanish Musicals. My own work focuses on the cultural and political translation of Brazilian and Cuban racial discourses into the 20th century nationalism in Angola. And my own work also draws from archives from Angola, Cuba, Brazil, and Portugal, where I am right now speaking to you in beautiful Lisbon. Now, before we invite our speakers to begin, I wanted to highlight a few thoughts that we might come back to in our discussion by the end of the presentations. Historians and social critics have pointed out that modernity imposes a regime of historicity, which means that history is what provides the possibility of public existence and therefore of political legitimacy. At the same time, history has traditionally relied heavily on the use of archives, initially only official or governmental archives, and later expanding the notion of archives to include microhistories and narratives of common people or the history of private life, for example. But still, we are talking about material archives, mostly written or materially recorded in some form. That produced, of course, a problem for historically marginalized groups who did not have access to recording their own existences and experiences, and thus of not producing their own archives. This is why Martinican author and writer Edouard Glissant claims that Black persons, Caribbean subjects, among others, live in a state of non-history for not being able to reconstitute their past that was not lived but suffered, which then results in their erasure from collective memory. In his words, I quote, "Because historical memory was too often erased, the Caribbean writer has to delve deeper into memory from the traces, sometimes latent, that he has identified in the reality around him or her." I close quotes. So the histories that we will see today reflect that reality. Our speakers bring histories that were not inscripted in the formal institutional codes. They were not inscribed in the archives. In that sense, how do these traces of history that they present today, gestures, erased discourses, use of body in protests, help us to interpret and reconstitute the positions and agency of these subjects in the past and in the present? How does this lack of history or this history of traces support also the making of new histories today? The other aspect that our speakers bring today is that these traces are profoundly disruptive of normative perceptions and discourses. It is the case of gestures that tell a different story of the formation of the European canon by Meira, discourses of blackness and beauty disruptive of the idea of humanity by Larissa Brewer-García, and present usage of body, Black female bodies, disruptive of the idea of Spanishness and of the national and of the citizen, by Jeffrey Coleman. In that sense, I also invite us to think how race and gender reveal the mechanisms of writing history, and also how race and gender, considered as central political categories of modernity, also informs new ways of making history. Well, we will be taking questions during the talks, so please submit your questions through the comment section or by email that you will find also in the comment section. Now, with these opening remarks, and without further ado, I would like to now open our roundtable with Meira Goldberg, whose talk today is titled Perra, Mora, Love and War in the Body of a Woman. Meira, thank you so much for joining us. It's with you now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to Jordana Mendelsohn, Laura Turegano, Alejandra Rosenberg Navarro, and Rafael Cesar. Thank you to the King Juan Carlos Cultural Center and to all my amazing and esteemed co-panelists. I'm celebrating and rooting for the success of El Taller as a non-hierarchical intellectual community designed to foster humanistic inquiry and collaboration relating to the arts, literatures, cultures, and histories of the Iberian Peninsula, and I'm honored to participate in this discussion. The research I'm sharing today is for a new book project, Perra, Mora, Love and War in the Body of a Woman. The Perra Mora, or Moorish bitch, is a Spanish Renaissance dance song, first recorded in the Cancionero Medinaceli of circa 1560. I'm studying the legacy of medieval Iberia's multilingual, multicultural, and multi-confessional society in what I am proposing is an ancestor of flamenco dance. As I did in my first monograph, Sonidos Negros, on the blackness of flamenco, I have already discovered patterns that shed light on so-called Western dance writ large, and indeed on culture, history, and the humanities more broadly. The Perra Mora, I will argue, is a stepping stone in the representation of race, at the same time that retains and transmits elements of Islamic performance into the European canon. Our conceptualizations of race grow out of the Spanish system of limpieza de sangre, or blood purity. These codified religious distinctions, enforced by the Inquisition and promulgated through dance iconography, were transposed into performance of the racialized distinctions that justified slavery and founded Spanish America. Christian whiteness, constituted as virtue and clarity in opposition to non-Christian blackness as devilish and lascivious confusion, thus permeates our aesthetic codes and canons even today. In Sonidos, I characterize the transmutation in performance of religious into racial difference as a process of the Moor becoming Black. The Perra Mora embodies this evolution, appearing in the late 16th century when Spain's American empire was expanding explosively, just as the Jewish-Muslim threat to Christian Europe was receding. My new book project addresses the methodological question of how practice-based dance knowledge fits and can be integrated into our study of history. Medieval and early modern dance was always transmitted orally and is only recorded in the most rudimentary fashion, even in the elite contexts in which it is recorded at all. My research references flamenco dance knowledge as a repository of non-white and non-elite practices. Shifting the focus towards bodies and bodies of knowledge that have heretofore been unrecognized, I am tracing a subterranean system that nourishes the European canon, but whose unique nature and constituent elements are often blanketed by the politics of whiteness. These questions are urgently pressing right now in light of our present reckoning with the harsh realities of racial violence, and I am aggrieved and appalled to say the name of yet another Black victim of police violence, Walter Wallace Jr. I believe these questions are urgent now also in light of the dehistoricizing, unmooring, and disembodying effects of living ever more intensely in the global media sphere. And I'm going to just show you a short video now. Son los toreros los que se ponen cinta en el pelo, los que se ponen cinta en el pelo. The gesture that I just did is the subject of my talk today. I call this gesture a pellizco, which means a pinch. And I'm gonna talk to you just extemporaneously right now, and then I can give you some of the historical work I'm doing with this gesture. But first I want to explain to you what it is. So this gesture, the thing I did, the gesture that I'm talking about today is actually kind of a constellation of 3 gestures. So I did this, and then I did this. And this dance step, flamenco dance step, has 3 parts. This thing I call a llamada, or a call. So this is basically what I will use to signal to the musicians that something is going to happen. It's kind of to get their attention. It's kind of to grab a hold of the microphone, if you will, or, you know, kind of let them know that I'm going to grab a hold of the microphone. And then after I've given them this warning, okay, and this is part of that. The thing that I call the pellizco is this, right? And what that is that I'm going up and down at the same time. So it's kind of a stretch. And this is the pellizco, which is the step that I'm specifically going to be talking to you today, but I want to talk to you about it in context. And then the thing that follows after that is son los toreros los que se ponen cinta en el pelo, los que se ponen cinta en el pelo. The gesture that I just did is the subject of my talk today. I call this gesture a pellizco, which means a pinch. And I'm going to talk to you just extemporaneously right now, and then I can give you some of the historical work I'm doing with this gesture. But first I want to explain to you what it is. So this gesture, the thing I did, the gesture that I'm talking about today is actually kind of a constellation of 3 gestures. So I did this, and then I did this. And this dance step, flamenco dance step, has 3 parts. This thing I call a llamada, or a call. So this is basically what I will use to signal to the musicians that something is going to happen. It's kind of to get their attention. It's kind of to grab a hold of the microphone, if you will, or, you know, kind of let them know that I'm going to grab a hold of the microphone. And then after I've given them this warning, okay, and this is part of that. The thing that I call the pellizco is this, right? And what that is that I'm going up and down at the same time. So it's kind of a stretch. And this is the pellizco, which is the step that I'm specifically going to be talking to you today, but I want to talk to you about it in context. And then the thing that follows after that is this step, which I call a cambio, or a change. It's kind of used to change states. And I'm going to talk to you also about it, how it functions rhythmically. Some people call this step an enganche, which means it hooks, it's a hook. So it hooks one section to another. It's a transition between sections. So flamenco, the rhythm I'm doing is called bulerías, and the rhythm is, we is in counts of 6, measures of 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And one thing that will drive you nuts about flamencos is that we start counting on 12. Like, I think it's probably, you know, international flamencos, because in Spain, people don't really count at all in that way. But anyway, so this, for our flamenco counts, this would be 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And my llamada, my call, is always going to come at the top of that measure. So it's going to come on the 12, right? So 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? That's on my 12, on the top of the measure. And the thing that I'm calling the pellizco is going to happen on the, what in flamenco counts would be a 4. So 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? So if we are in this measure of 6, one way this thing works as a signal is in a rhythmic way. So if we're doing bulerías, my foot is going on every other beat. So 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And on top of that, my hands are going 12, 3, 6, 9, 12, 3, 6, 9. So there's a 2 overlaid with a 3. And each of those ways of accentuating are incipient, are inherent within each measure. So one way that this signal works, so this signal is like a warning. First, I'm going to say, look at me, I'm about to do something. And then I'm going to go, whoa, like that is to give you the imminent, it's imminently going to come this change of state to another thing. So one way that this works is by pulling on the rhythm as a hemiola, right? So you'll notice that this is in 2s, right? And then I would go from there, I'd probably go back to 3. So I would say, you know, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. Ba, 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 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? So one way this functions is as a kind of a rhythmic signal. And the other way that this pellizco functions that is very important is it functions in the context of the sung verse. So this pellizco, this can be done in, you know, a zillion different ways, but the basic physical going up, I always say that this pellizco is kind of like when you step into the bathtub and you have that, you know, that moment of just pleasure, or you sip of hot chocolate or something like that. Oh, it's like a little shiver of pleasure. And what happens after that is it goes up and then it goes down. So da ga da da di, down, right? And that could be the ole, ole, ba ga da da, ole, right? So what's interesting about this gesture and why I'm interested in it is that all flamencos do this pellizco, this gesture, always. So you don't have to be a dancer. You can be a guitarist. You can be a singer. You can be a palmero. You can be an audience member. But part of listening, basically, part of being, you know, part of the stream of music is to do that gesture. And what that gesture does is it structures not only the rhythm, or, you know, maybe this signal is a rhythmic signal, right? By pulling on the rhythm into a 2 from a 3, for example, as a signal, right? As this change of state. But the pellizco coming before that change of state, you know, is kind of like the warning before that. And that functions in a very specific way on top of the flamenco letra. So the thing I sang was, son los toreros los que se ponen cintas en el pelo, okay? The bullfighters are the ones that wear ribbons in their hair. And this is, you could think of this as 4 lines or 2 lines, right? You could say, son los toreros, that could be the first line. And the second one, los que se ponen cintas en el pelo. Now, in flamenco, we have this basic value, which is to rematar el cante, which is to finish off the verse, okay? There are many ways to do that. It can be very complicated, but kind of very simply, right? And so what's happening is I'm going to say, son los toreros, son los toreros. That first line went by completely. And in fact, I could give the singer, it would be better for me to sort of stay out of that because the singer could have a lot of freedom there to elaborate on that first line. Son los toreros, son los toreros, son los toreros, son los toreros. I could do that if I want to, right? I'm not a singer, but I could do that if I wanted to, or if I were a real singer. But then when I get to the second line, my goal in life is to try to finish with that second line, to somehow acknowledge the ending of that second line. So one of the things that I'm doing with this llamada and then the pellizco is to give everybody the warning that I'm with them, I'm going to finish with you. The title of the online conference presentation I just showed you is Tracing Duende. I just told you what a pellizco is. Duende is the spirit that haunts us. Sometimes people call duende flamenco's version of soul. The term contains a lot of ambiguity, which is central to the flamenco ethos. Following the great Black cultural theorists from Du Bois to Ellison to Morrison to Jana Brown, I have in my first book linked flamenco's purposeful equivocation or bulla, ruckus, to its Blackness. Here, I am using the term duende from an emic perspective, in the sense of being haunted by the past. I'm viewing flamenco as embodying its past, and I'm theorizing the circle of flamenco practice as a resonant sound chamber in which the past is immanent. My contention is that flamenco's gestural codes are so basic and so structuring of the unfolding improvisational flow that they are really a cultural embodiment. For many families, and especially Andalusian Roma families, flamenco is a cultural practice, something they've been brought up with. The pellizco is a gesture of the flamenco circle. Everyone, dancers, singers, musicians, and audience does it, and at the same time. And this shared gesture not only communally embodies the verse and not only structures the improvisational flow, but the pellizco is also expressive of the shared dimension of emotion within the flamenco circle. The verse I was singing is, son los toreros, lo que se ponen cinta en el pelo. And the poetic or metric structure of this verse, which is part of the flamenco oral songbook, is called a seguidilla. The earliest seguidillas have 4 5-syllable lines, with the first and third lines and the second and fourth lines rhyming. The seguidillas are very old in Spain. They were old in the 17th century, as Correas in his 1626 dictionary explains. While few traces of medieval dance survive, hundreds of poems from the medieval Iberian songbook, some with notated music, have been conserved and exhaustively studied. We know that these lyrics were sung and danced, and that Western culture has retained many traces of this performance, from instruments such as the lute to verse rhyme structures in carols such as Jingle Bells and, I contend, in flamenco. The seguidilla verse, son los toreros, is what we call an estribillo or refrain. Medieval Iberian lyrics are strikingly similar to flamenco verses in incorporating a melodic and rhyming signal into their structure, a prompt for the audience to join in, today in saying ole, as I showed you in the video, in Al-Andalus or medieval Iberia, in singing the estribillo. As I explained, in medieval Iberian verse forms, Similar to the lines of Son los toreros, there are sections. The introductory section is freer. This is the section of the verse where the singer has the most freedom to extend, play, and repeat. Then follows a penultimate section. This is what the pellizco marks, which gives melodic and rhyming indications to the audience that the final line of the verse is coming. Because in Al-Andalus, the audience sang the estribillo over and over, it was memorized and thus readily transmitted as a portable fragment from song to song and from generation to generation. Indeed, the estribillo is central to flamenco syntax today. What I'm hypothesizing is that the flamenco pellizco, which functions as a corporeal, vocal, rhythmic, and as I explained in describing the pleasure associated with this gesture, emotional materialization of the ending of the verse, is a trace from the medieval past. Thus, I am researching whether flamenco's embodiment of the structures of the medieval Iberian lyric records a heretofore unrecognized corporeal presence of this Afro-Islamicate medieval world. This is the methodological problem that I'm engaging with, how to use dance knowledge to write history. The theoretical problem I'm thinking about is how to contextualize cultural reproduction and transmission politically and truthfully, granularly, yet fluidly. The word seguidilla comes from the verb seguir, which means to follow. And the medieval Iberian verse forms, whose characteristics the seguidillas retain, themselves contained poetic quotation or contrafacta as a generator of form. And the lyric poetry of medieval Iberia, like its European descendants, as often as not quotes the other parodically as a put down. So I'm thinking about, and I look forward to your thoughts on this, how to look at parody as a form of contrafacta, which, despite laying out the representational pathways of racism, serves nonetheless as a conduit in the reproduction and transmission of culture. In this vein, I'm beginning to study queer performance theory and Halberstam's notion of failure within art forms like flamenco, which, despite being referentially opposed to their surface, still make listeners, when the duende is there, rend their garments. Ultimately, I want to trace the multi-confessional spiritual systems referenced within these Iberian modes of singing, and to wonder whether traces of these too are present in flamenco today. The communally embodied emotional dimension of the pellizco speaks to the ecstatic borderlessness, the explodedness of the self in love that I think haunts what is true in flamenco, its power to inhabit indeterminacy or bulla, to sing from a place of no place, of radical displacement and operatic identity, yet moving listeners to rend their garments. Such spiritual connections would help explain the deep synchronicities between flamenco's ethos and ethics of radical homelessness embodied by the Spanish Roma, and the diasporic identities of its Jewish, Muslim, and African ancestors. Thank you.
Thank you, Meira. And now we'll follow with Larissa Brewer-García, whose the title today is Conversion, Translation, and the Making of Blackness in Colonial Cartagena de Indias.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Meira. And thank you to the taller and everyone who worked so hard to make this happen. This conversation is really interesting and I'm thrilled to participate. So I'll be speaking about the fourth chapter of my recent book, and we'll be moving from Andalusia to Cartagena de Indias in the Caribbean. And Cartagena de Indias is a city on the Caribbean coast of today's Colombia. In the first half of the 17th century, it was the most important way station for ships arriving in the Americas from the western coast of Africa, bringing in enslaved peoples during the boom of the transatlantic slave trade to Spanish America. In fact, most of the Black men and women taken to Spanish America during this period passed through Cartagena de Indias as the first point of entry after crossing the Atlantic Ocean, before being shipped to Peru through Panama or being sent to work in the fields or mines of the interior of New Granada. And New Granada, broadly defined, is the areas of Venezuela, what's now Colombia, Ecuador. And so we are in this area that it connects the Caribbean to the Andes and to Northern South America more broadly. But Cartagena also connected and served as a way station for other points in the Caribbean. So the collection of texts that I'm going to be talking about today focus on evangelical efforts that the Jesuit order undertook in Cartagena, and the ways in which these documents describe the use of Black bodies and Black interpreters in producing language of what it meant to become Black Christians in this region, in this way station, in this port, and as an opening into to thinking about multiple ways in which translation was functioned and worked, and not only in creating the documents that still survive to think about these instantiations, but also in shaping our historical memory of what this period was and how to read texts about it. According to the collection of 17th century Jesuit texts about these evangelical efforts, when a slave ship entered Cartagena's harbor, a Jesuit priest and a group of enslaved Black interpreters would paddle a small boat to the ship to greet the new arrivals. So the ship was in the harbor, it had not yet arrived in the port. And once on board, the interpreter with the priest by their side would provide water, food, and medical attention to the enslaved men, women, and children. And then they would explain to them in whatever language is necessary or possible that the ship had arrived in the land of the whites, and quote unquote, and that all the captives aboard would soon become Christian. In a testimony that one of these African interpreters gave later about the work that they would do and the work that he remembers doing himself, he also describes this moment of remembering being on one of those ships himself as a young boy and being presented with this news of arrival and where they had arrived. And this, I'm quoting from a man named Andrés Sacabuche, who was born in Angola and who was one of the most important of a group of enslaved interpreters the Jesuit order purchased and kept in the Jesuit school in Cartagena to bring them to the ships and help them with evangelical work that oftentimes meant meeting them where they were housed temporarily in houses that served as barracoons, and then accompanying them again when they were reshipped. And so they're kind of the ambassadors, the ushers of coming in, coming out. And one of the most important things that they did was to make sure that everyone was baptized before they either left Cartagena again or were purchased and sold away from the city if they stayed nearby. And this moment of thinking about the work of translation is important because it wasn't just one language to another. It wasn't just Spanish or Portuguese to an African language, but several, multiple. And the Jesuits have to create a new system because it's very different from the strategies that they employed to evangelize indigenous peoples at this moment, of how to deal with such a multilingual constituency. And at the same time, also craft and create this idea of what a Black Christian was, when Blackness wasn't something that every person disembarking from Western Africa already knew, already had a definition. It was something that really, really created through the experience of the Middle Passage, enslavement, arrival, and as I argue in the larger book, it created in dialogue with the category of Christianity and with the process of Christian baptism. And so here's the discourse. This is the conversation that Andrés Sacabuche remembers hearing when he was a young boy aboard the slave ship. Through the interpreters in the middle of the ship, the father told those Black men and women that he had come there to be the father and protector of all, and to tell them they should treat the whites well, and they should let others know that the whites did not take them there to kill and to eat them, as the Blacks who had imprisoned them in their lands would do, but to teach them the law of God, through which they would save their souls that were immortal. And so the Spaniards, and so they should serve the Spaniards, which would make the Spaniards love them very much. With this, the father, through the interpreters, would encourage them and disabuse them of the lie with which the Black men and women become imbued, firmly believing that the whites take them to their lands to kill and eat them and turn them into oil and gunpowder. This witness is Angolan, as he has already said, and understood this himself when they brought him from his land to Cartagena. End of quote. Andrés Sacabuch's orally delivered account was written down by a Spanish notary for the purpose of documenting Catalonian Jesuit Pedro Claver's labor among Black men and women in Cartagena for Claver's beatification process. And now Pedro Claver was born in Catalunya. He's a white, who's a white individual who was canonized in the 19th century and is recognized widely in Colombia as a national saint, and mentioned along with his epithet, the slave of the enslaved, which is something that is attributed to him in the beatification inquest. And now there's that inquest, there's a printed version that was made in Rome, and we still have a manuscript copy of all the testimonies that were collected in Cartagena in order to make that printed book that that goes beyond what the printed text was. And so that's, I'll be citing from that manuscript. And in particular, so what Sacabuch's testimony offers us is that this initial speech presented through translation on the slave ship instantiated new meanings for a series of key terms for the men, women, and children arriving in Cartagena. These are being Black, being servants of Spaniards, and being Christian. In particular, Sacabuch's testimony divides being Black into two different types: being Black in their lands of origin and being Black in Spanish lands. Texts such as this one that describe the exchanges between Black interpreters and Black new arrivals from this period indicate the circulation of notions of Blackness produced in Spanish America that really demand more of our critical attention, because they offer insight into the adaptation, adoption, and transformation of racial categories by racialized individuals themselves in the early modern Atlantic world. After their initial welcome visit on board the slave ships, the interpreters would lead catechisms in African languages to the new arrivals soon after they had disembarked. Whether or not a priest was present at these sessions, and oftentimes they weren't, the messages shared in these catechisms were inaccessible to the priests because they were conducted in languages the priests could not understand. As a result, the messages weren't written down. What's important to note about this is that it doesn't mean that the language exchange in those conversations was irrevocably lost to oblivion, or we only can use our imagination to try to think with them, but we can actually methodologically think with what has been left behind. And in particular, by comparing the scripts of what the priests said they told their interpreters to say with what later the interpreters said they said in those communications and catechetical conversations. And by using this method in the 4th chapter of my book, I identify archival traces of language used by interpreters in collaboration with Black new arrivals to describe what it meant to become Black Christians in Spanish America in this period. And what's important, and then as you'll see as I continue to share fragments from this research, is that the Black body and visual images of Black bodies were central in articulating this discourse created in translation. And so the two sets of texts I'll be talking about to do that kind of comparison today are, one is Alonso de Sandoval's relatively well-known treatise on Black evangelization, known by its subtitle on restoring Ethiopian health, or De Instaranda Ethiopium Salute. It was published in Seville in 1627. And the much less well-known text that I compare it to is that collection of beatification testimonies. So this is those testimonies. The inquest is when everyone has to go, it's like a legal trial, and you say all the good things about the person who might be held up as a saint, and you give the stories and you say, I attest to having experienced and watched the said miracle happen, or they're all of their virtuous works. And so that collection of testimonies is where we have renditions of what it meant for these Black interpreters to accompany Claver or to do his work for him. As he got older, he would stay home and the interpreters would do the evangelical work themselves, and then they talk about it in the testimony, and that's what I look at in that chapter. And so in Alonso de Sandoval's treatise, he explains for other European missionaries how to tell Black interpreters to explain the catechism in their respective languages for the new audiences. And when he does so, he gives very specific instructions that I'm going to offer some of them here so we can think about what's given and then later what's adapted. And so one of the ways he explains that the interpreter should describe Christian baptism is by comparing the pouring of baptismal water to cleansing one's soul of filth. And the second, he compares it to the branding of their bodies. And here I'll quote Sandoval. Tell them with that water that will be poured on them. Their souls will become white and cleansed of sin and will be marked as children of God, just as the sign and mark with which they are branded shows they are slaves of their masters. End of quote. For the interpreters in the Black catechumens who had experienced the Middle Passage and the branding of their bodies before and perhaps also after arrival in Cartagena, such material and corporal explanations would have vividly invoked their own experiences of enslavement. The first analogy associates baptism with acquiring a cleanliness antithetical to the physical conditions of the 2-month crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. And I'll come back to Sandoval's comment about whiteness, about the whiteness of the soul a little later. The second analogy communicates the permanence of the Christian transformation through reference to branding, or the searing of flesh that marked their bodies as property. It's possible that this allusion to branding was useful in Sandoval's perception because it imparted connotations of a transformation that was inevitable and also permanent. Both analogies explain baptism by animating experiences related to enslavement the interpreters and catechumens would have had in common. And finding these points of commonality, I find, in reading Sandoval's instructions, were really important, in part because there were so many different languages and places of origin where the people arriving in Cartagena from Western Africa, that it was hard to have a coherent system of references. And so what I'm noted in his descriptions is often their own experience, what they all have in common is that experience of enslavement. And so much of the metaphorical language used and material, sort of almost literal language used to describe things that are, the Christian mysteries of the faith and what it means to be Christian, what hell means, what heaven means, are all crafted in relation to that experience of enslavement, displacement, sickness, etc. And so the way heaven is described is, health and clothing and care and these sorts of strong contrasts with sickness, death, deprivation, chains, etc. And so this is one way in which the language is made accessible in translation in Sandoval's eyes. Documents related to Claver's ministry in Cartagena after Sandoval completed his treaties reveal several key ways Claver and his interpreters adapted the recommendations in the 30 years that followed the treatise's publication. Andres Sacawuch's description in the inquest really stresses several things, but I'm going to focus on two, and these have to do with emphasizing teaching embodied citational behavior and employing visual images to teach Christian concepts. The increased dependence on the catechumens' bodies and the use of religious imageries for the delivery of the catechism reflects a greater role that Black bodies began to play in producing discourse about a specifically Black experience of Christianity over the course of the first half of the 17th century. And here, this adaptation, Sacawuch explains, entailed things such as teaching new arrivals the tenets of the catechism by using their hands as mnemonic devices. In doing so, they would make their fingers speak. And here I'm going to cite Sacawuch, saying with his fingers on his left hand, touching them with the index finger of his right, that the thumb of the left hand signals Jesus, the index finger Christ, the middle finger Son of God, the ring finger you were my mother and my father, and the pinky finger I love you very, very, very much. End of quote. The strategy, as explained by Sacawuch's testimony, taught Black catechumens to inscribe meanings onto their own hands in order to read them later as a way of remembering the catechism. Teaching Black captives to speak with and read their bodies coincides with what historian of religion Michel Molina has called the structural ritual actions of Jesuit missionary activity in colonial Spanish America that elicited embodied responses and were, in her words here, harnessed to a discursive regime centered on salvation. Another example that I analyze in my book, and I will only mention briefly here, is a collective act of penitence that would happen before the baptismal ceremony, in which the interpreters and the priests would lead a group of people in performing a snake molting its skin. So the testimonies in the inquest explain that the priests and the interpreters would lead a group of catechumens in scratching at the skin of their torsos and their arms to embody and express their regret for their past actions and their non-Christian beliefs and behaviors. In these examples, the Black body appears as a mnemonic device and a means of enacting a rejection of a past life. While these descriptions foreground the use of catechumens' bodies and those of Black interpreters, none of them explicitly reflects on Blackness itself, but those reflections and references to Blackness do appear in how interpreters supplemented doctrinal instruction through visual images. And one of those images is a painted canvas that was used in baptismal ceremonies for these groups of new arrivals. The image is described in the testimonies in the inquest as that of a Black man kneeling before a baptismal font filled with Christ's blood. And so it was an allegorical image in which Christ is standing in the middle of the baptismal font and bleeding into the font. And the Jesuit priest is collecting the blood from the bleeding into the font and pouring it over the man kneeling at his feet. And that man is described by the interpreters when later they're talking about how they would evangelize in this context using this painting and as a point of reference before the baptism, explaining that and here I'm going to quote from interpreter Jose Mansolo from West Central Africa, where he explains, and here I cite, the Jesuit father in the painting was baptizing a Black man kneeling at his feet who was becoming extremely beautiful upon receiving the holy baptism, end of quote. Mansolo's testimony's detail about the Black man's changing appearance implies the baptism produced a transformation similar to an alchemical process that might convert one kind of metal into another, a kind of complete transformation. And other testimonies in the inquest add a crucial detail that the Black man's beauty contrasts with the appearance of a group of very ugly Black men in the painting who had not yet been baptized standing next to him. And the composition of this particular painting in Cartagena that shows that that the beauty and the transformation were ushered to talk about a relationship of cause and effect to demonstrate was supposedly an interior transformation of the converted Black Christian. And so what did the beauty entail? Was it represented visually on the canvas, or was it only a verbal element added to affect its perception? You know, we could think about how were they dressed, where was the composition, what way were bodies presented in relation to the other figures on the canvas. We don't know these things, unfortunately, because the painting does not seem to have survived. And so what we can do is leave that question open and work from the recognition that however it might have actually appeared on the painting, language to describe extremely beautiful Black converts circulated from the 1620s to the 1650s in the Caribbean port as part of Black baptismal ceremonies. Significantly, it does not appear that the artist of the painting or any of the interpreters, we have about 13 different descriptions of the painting, none of them describe the beautiful Black baptized man as wider than the rest of the group. And as I mentioned, I would return to the Sandoval's point about explaining a baptized soul as becoming white and clean. This is a commonplace that Meira referenced at the beginning of her own talk about thinking about whiteness and purity in relation to a color distinction between Black and white. And it is actually a commonplace that had a 1,000-year history in Europe before this moment in early modern colonial Spanish America. And so this notion that that's not there is pretty significant, especially because whenever the Jesuits speak to themselves about their work, they talk about it as whitening and bleaching, and then it's definitely not in these descriptions of how the interpreters describe that transformation. So I think that deserves to be thought with and kept present. We don't know what the interpreters' undeclared intentions were in the narration of their testimonies in the inquest. We can't know how much was changed by the notary who put their words into writing, or the translator who rendered their transcripts into Italian in Rome 11 years later. These are really highly mediated texts, and I don't want to suggest otherwise, but just because they're highly mediated doesn't mean we can't think with them and think with what we have. And I think when we talk about what we have, we see these descriptions of physical beauty and Christian virtue that are some of the most salient differences that emerge. And I didn't have a chance to really develop another argument, another example, but the interpreters, when they're talking positively about Claver, their supervisor themselves, they'll use turns of phrase that describe him as Black in relation to his virtue. Like they cared for them as if he were another Black man. And so I find these figurative uses of Blackness also contribute to this idea that there is a way in which Blackness is circulating among these interpreters that is not the same uses of Blackness that we see in the varieties of ways in which it's employed in early modern Spain and the Spanish America of this period. And so This emphasis on beauty and virtue offers a counter narrative to the more well-known account of the 17th century as a period in which associations between Blackness, slavery, and abject dispossession or barbarity solidified. And colonial studies scholarship has rightly, in many senses, stressed the roles played by writing and visual culture as mechanisms of instantiating racial hierarchies, placing light-skinned European elites above darker-skinned men and women of the American territories of the 16th and 17th centuries. And I don't want to say that that's not a general trend and that that isn't true, but these collections of texts that I examine in my book, and I've mentioned some of them here, provide really important exceptions to those general trends, demonstrating that the theological importance of informed consent for baptism that motivated Jesuits to use interpreters to evangelize in Cartagena in the first place resulted in the production of a corpus of writings about African interpreters from which we can access other messages, images, and repertoires related to Blackness that were created by Black men and women in the early modern Atlantic. And it's my hope that these off-centered yet present pieces of evidence in the archive can help us tell new stories about the making of Blackness in colonial Spanish America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larissa, Brewer-García. I'd like to remind everybody who's watching that you can submit your questions through the comment section or by email that you'll find also in the comment section on the Facebook page. Now we'll continue with Jeffrey Coleman. The title of his talk is No es país para negras and the future of Black Spain. Thank you, Jeffrey, for being today with us.
Thank you, Rafael. I'd like to begin by thanking the King Juan Carlos Center, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for the invitation. This talk is stemmed from my current book project, tentatively titled España Negra, The Consumption and Rejection of Blackness in Contemporary Spain, in which I analyze the portrayals and appropriations of Blackness in the 20th and 21st century Spain. My objective today is to use Silvia Albert Sopales' 2016 play, No es país para negras, as a point of departure from which to discuss the development of Black Spain as a site of critical inquiry within peninsular studies. My contention is that this play constitutes a piece of a new archive, one in which Black Spanish women have come forth to articulate their Spanishness, and thus the creation of Black Spain. Therefore, I will speak about the play itself and then transition to speaking about the larger implications that the play divulges and end with a short reflection on what this means for our field. The vast majority of cultural production and peninsular studies scholarship that concerns Black people does so in regard to immigrants. For example, Spanish theater has for decades focused on Black people as migrants unworthy of staying in Spain. In my book, in my first book, which recently came out, The Necropolitical Theater, Race and Immigration on the Contemporary Spanish Stage, I examined how white Spanish playwrights portrayed immigration in plays from 1991 to 2016 in order to expose the racial hierarchy woven into their works, one that clearly places Black migrants at the bottom. This narrative trope has been maintained through a necropolitical means in which death serves as a way to pacify white anxieties around race and changing demographics. Over time, this trope has become increasingly problematic because it not only perpetuates the notion that Black people are in an eternal state of arrival as migrants or refugees, but also connotes that the Black population is much smaller than it is, despite the fact that there are now second and even third generation Black citizens in the nation today. And we don't have exact numbers, but one can estimate that the Black population in Spain today is around 2 million people. As such, it has been important for me to shift the focus of my current and future work to the representation of Blackness as it affects Black Spaniards in order to decenter the racialized notion of whom is considered to be Spanish. Silvia Albert Sopale, an Afro-Spanish woman born in 1976 to Equato-Guinean and Nigerian parents, born and raised in San Sebastián in the Basque Country, is an example of the first generation of Black citizens in the contemporary era. As a classically trained actress, she has worked in theater, film, and television. Her first play, No es país para negras, debuted in 2016, and her second play, Blackface y otras vergüenzas, in 2019. Her plays constitute the creation of an archive, one in which Black people portray themselves rather than be subjects of representation distilled into problematic, if not racist, stereotypes. For the sake of brevity, I will only discuss her first play as it directly addresses the impact of everyday racism, to use the term of Filomena Essed. No es país para negras is a one-woman show in which Silvia Alberto Pale performs an autobiographical journey from childhood to adulthood through a series of vignettes that serve to illustrate the struggles of Black female citizenship in Spain. Throughout the play, the perniciousness of Spanish racism is deconstructed. And I say Spanish racism because whereas I believe anti-Black racism to be a global phenomenon in which Black people are understood as both pathogen and phobogen, to use Fanon's terminology, the particularities of Spain's history with Blackness, as we have seen in the previous two presentations, are distinct and noteworthy because, as David Theo Goldberg notes, quote, the force of race assumes its power in and from the thick context of the different, if related, geopolitical regions in which it is embedded, end quote. The play denies the Spanish audience the opportunity to externalize race and racism as, quote, a disruption, as the invader, as over there, end quote, because race is entangled in the Spanish national imaginary. What's different now is that it is racialized people, in this case, Black Spaniards, speaking for themselves. One thing that's fascinating about this play is that it directly addresses contemporary debates on race in order to rebuke Spanish colorblindness. For example, the first vignette concerning childhood begins with the jingles of Conguitos and Colacao, two brands notorious for their racist marketing iconography. For those unfamiliar with these brands, Colacao is a chocolate drink enhanced with minerals, first released in 1945, and its famous jingle about a Black man cultivating cacao debuted in 1955 and is now a classic in Spanish marketing. Conguitos is a candy consisting of peanuts dipped in chocolate, so think of them as peanut M&Ms without the shell. And the name translates as Little People from the Congo, as the brand was created in 1961 as a nod to Congolese independence from Belgium the year prior. Both brands utilize racist imagery to market these products to children, which has in turn created a market for racial nostalgia today. Whereas Colacao recently changed its logo to better reflect the times, Conguito has doubled down on its logo and name. This summer, members of Spain's Black Lives Matter movement started a petition to get La Casa, the owner of the Conguitos brand, to change its iconography or pull the candy from its product line. What surged in response was the hashtag Conguitos Lives Matter, in which thousands of Spaniards, including some politicians affiliated with the far-right political party Vox, defended the brand and its imagery on social media as a paramount piece of Spanish culture. Thus, a brand that had previously claimed to be only about chocolate, not race, has clearly fallen subject to white racial nostalgia. And so the play utilizes these iconic jingles as a way to signal the triggering impact they have had on Black Spaniards. For example, Black Spanish children are often referred to as conguitos as a term of endearment. And of course, Black people are commodified and exoticized as sexy chocolate. Not only does Blackness become commodified, but it is consistently othered. The most powerful example, one that captures the magnitude of what it means to be a Black Spaniard, is when Silvia proclaims the following, quote, negra, catalana, vasca, murciana, guineana, española, africana y olé. Y en mis 37 años de vida me han preguntado si soy nigeriana, camerunesa, congoleña, senegalesa, brasileña, colombiana, cubana, neoyorquina, francesa, portuguesa, pero jamás nadie nunca me ha preguntado si soy de aquí. Negra sí, negra, negra, negra soy. como mi madre, como Desiree, como Concha Buica, como Lucía Imbomio, mis sistas, negra sí, negra soy, como tú, end quote. This quote maps the sociocultural and political terrain and provides us with the opportunity to further theorize Blackness in Spain. Sylvia is viewed as a perpetual outsider, despite being born and raised in Spain, despite speaking fluent Spanish and Catalan, because Blackness is still considered to be mutually exclusive to Spanishness. The list of nationalities to which people assume she belongs spans African and Latin American nations, which we should understand as imperial vestiges or Blackness over there, as well as cosmopolitan spaces that have large Black populations, New York, Paris, Lisbon. This mapping not only allows us to understand the diaspora's reach, but also signposts Spain as a liminal space, neither a former colony, but not yet entirely cosmopolitan. At the end of her declaration, she references other pivotal Black women in her life, which leads me to the second part of my argument, that this play serves as a bridge to which to understand how Black women specifically have formed spaces that have shaped the national discussions of race in order to claim a stake in Spanishness. Desiree Bela Lobede is a feminist blogger and the author of Ser una mujer negra en España that was published in 2018. Her writing on the politics of hair for Black women and articulations of Spanish racism have made her a superstar in feminist and Afro-Spanish circles. Afro-Spanish singer Concha Buica is known for her powerful voice and for shaking up the flamenco world as a Black woman. Lucía Imbomio, Spanish journalist and the author of two books, Las que se atrevieron and Hija del Camino, is another leading voice regarding the experiences of Black people in Spain. And so these three women, plus Silvia Alberto Pale herself, represent a generation of Afro-Spanish citizens who are pushing back against racist norms in order to make clear that Blackness is present and here to stay. The last part of the quote, negra soy como tú, is one of the few moments in the play in which the fourth wall is broken and Sylvia speaks directly to the spectator. And so this play captures and addresses many of the experiences of many Black Spanish women. And so when I went to see the play in Madrid 3 years ago, the audience was predominantly Black, something that I have never experienced in all my years of theatrical fieldwork in Spain. And so during the talk back after the performance, many of the audience members, Black women in their 20s and early 30s, spoke emotionally of how several of the vignettes sparked flashbacks of similar racist encounters they had had in their youth and how happy they were to know that they were not alone. The act of recognition displayed in Negra Soy Como Tú signifies an affective solidarity that is ultimately necessary to build a community that is not imagined in the Andersonian sense, but rather lived. And so the lived experiences of Black Spain are palpable on social media today, where collectives such as Afrofeminas, Black Barcelona, and the Black View consistently call attention to issues of afflicting Black Spaniards, be they professional, political, or social. These groups facilitate community building through the curation of spaces in which the Black Spanish experience can be discussed, problematized, and transmitted to a wider audience. They are also a beacon to which members of the community can learn about events, physical in the pre-pandemic times and now virtually. And finally, these groups are increasingly self-referential, thus creating emic knowledge, which is to say knowledge that is developed and determined by the group itself. An example of this is the rejection of the term gente de color, or people of color, in favor of the more specific personas racializadas, racialized people, or simply Black, negro. These groups thus articulate a vision of Black Spain as a coherent community. And as Borst and Gallo Gonzalez note, quote, given the pact of oblivion and lack of memory reigning in Spain, digital platforms such as Negras magazine or Afrofeminas consequently serve as digital archive to remember African and Afro-descendant peoples' past and present stories, otherwise forgotten or silenced, and to fight with joint forces against colonial legacy, end quote. Archives, too, are imbued with power and privilege, and thus through cultural production and social media, Black Spaniards work against the racist epistemologies embedded in the Spanish National Archive. So why does all of this matter? As the events of this summer have demonstrated, anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon that manifests in different ways in different parts of the world. The murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd earlier this year sparked protests and marches worldwide, including in Spain, as it too is no stranger to police violence against Black people, such as the case of Mame Mbaye in 2018. However, as I stated at the beginning of my presentation, Spanish anti-Blackness is unique and worthy of direct consideration. The academic field of Black European studies has primarily focused on the UK, France, and Germany, the European nations with the largest Black populations, but this summer has made clear, to quote from Fannie Lou Hamer, that nobody's free until everybody's free. And thus, the experiences and cultural production of Black Spain need to become a focal point of academic scrutiny in the years to come to decenter even the archive of Black European studies, as is currently happening in Italy, for example. In addition, as academics in the United States who study Spain, it is important that we do not reproduce the hegemonic and racist epistemic violence of invisibilizing Black Spain within our curricula and programs. And just as Peninsular Studies had to reckon with feminist and queer turns in the previous decades, it is frankly overdue that critical race studies be better woven into how we understand Spain today. No es país para negras outlines the specificities of racism in Spain that continue to emotionally, if not physically, harm Black people today. The play is articulating new notions of what it means to be Spanish, a concept that must be continuously questioned and reevaluated as the nation's demographics shift further away from its purported homogeneity. Whereas over the past 3 decades, the representation of Black men in the media and arts has been used as a way to project Blackness as a threat to the Spanish state. Black women today are representing themselves and the larger Black community through the arts, journalism, social media, politics, and other realms as a way to project forth a future Spain that is multicultural, multiracial, and ultimately anti-racist. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and thank you all for those wonderful talks. Certainly there's a lot that we can think about from those talks. So I'll hand it over now to Eva Woods for us to start our Q&A. Eva, thank you so much.
You're so welcome, Rafael. Thank you to all. And wow, brilliant, incisive papers, creative excavations of the archive. Thank you to our panelists. And this is a very unique panel, and it is part of, as Jeffrey said very well, a larger effort that ushers in a very much needed reckoning with the racism of the field of Iberian studies. So let's talk about the archive. As scholars who study archives that house violent, dehumanizing content, can you talk about your strategies for reconciling the unimaginable horror that was and is with the detachment demanded by the academic book format? In other words, we write not just about extreme violence, but oftentimes situations so unimaginably violent that they are beyond description. How do you acknowledge that violence, or even provide a gesture of care for your reader or yourself, yet still dissect it under the analytical and academic lens? And just before, I'll give you 1 second because we will go until 4:15. So to extend the question and answer session, and please, audience members, send us your questions. Thank you. I think we'll just take it. Maybe you want to put your hand up. If I was thinking this would be a question for the three of you. And then we have some questions that are already in, and they are specific questions for each panelist so far.
So who would like to start then?
I'll go first since I went first for my talk. Thank you both. What amazing work. I'm so inspired and interested, and I hope that these conversations continue, and I really look forward to reading your work. You know, I guess you know, the thing that the material I was talking about today is for a book that I'm working on now, and this book comes out of a chapter that I had to leave out of Sonidos Negros because, you know, of the word limit. And Sonidos Negros really ended up being about race, and it really ended up being about how race is represented in the body. And I ended up really talking a lot about how flamenco is opposed to its own surface. You know, like flamenco undermines its own surface in this kind of, you know, doubled consciousness or doubled representative way. So I certainly think that bringing that to the fore is very, very important in order to not crush readers with the, you know, with this, you know, the truth of history and the weight of history. You know, I think that it's really important to identify the places where power has been exercised in very successful ways. And I think that that's just everywhere around us. You know, if you just look at the culture, you know, the culture clearly demonstrates that. And you know, what I'm doing with this new research is kind of even more. So like, as I was listening to both of your talks, Larissa and Jeffrey, I was just thinking about the body and dance and music, and you know, it's right there. Like all of those African cultures are right there. And so I think that in some ways, just letting people see themselves in as agents of change and formation of culture, I think is really powerful.
Thank you so much, Meira.
I'll add, if we're going to go in our order of presentation, it's a tricky question. I think it depends on if there's one thing about how I deal with the things that I read and find, and then the other thing is how I present it to the reader, which I think are two different stages. But sometimes I just have to write my reaction out before I'm ready to think analytically about it. And so I write about how it makes me feel, or I have to talk with someone about how horrible the situation is, or if it's something that's particularly compelling, or you know, you want to share the positive things, but sometimes you have to share the really uncomfortable ones too. And so after that, then I go back and I often ask myself what formal aspect of what I encountered made me feel that way. And so then I go and I look at form. One of the ways in which it's not in my book, but it's another project that's developing from that material, is looking at how the sensorium, the things beyond just what you can see, is actually employed in a lot of these testimonies about explaining and making a Christian conversion a palpable, understandable. And so things like sense of smell, sense of taste, sense of touch, and that kind of way. I ask myself, and then I go with my sort of formal questions, and you know, what produced that feeling of repugnance or disgust or sadness when I read, and then I take it to the analytical level. So Eva, that's part of your question about like, what are my methods? And I think the first one is that you just have to kind of react to it, and the next is to take it sort of and if you want the, it depends on the purpose of what you're writing, but in this particular case, it's, okay, so what produced that particular effect on me, if that's part of my interest, how was that part of the intent or in the genre of text was to produce that part of, is the way I'm feeling what was meant, was how the text was shaped in order for me to produce that feeling, or am I feeling something that's very particular to my subject position I'm right now? And so I like to dialogue with that and to try to say something substantive. I think it's sometimes you just have to call it a day if you've had a really hard time with reading some of these materials, and you can only do it for a few hours a day. And that's, but there's also, as Meira, I think, commented, and I'm here extrapolating a little bit from your comment, but there's also things that are really, because of how hard some of this material is, so exciting when we find something like a story that really deserves to be told. And these are stories that people should have access to, not just academics.
Right, exactly.
And so making that accessible, trying to build the scaffolding so people can understand it and read it and access it, I think is another way in which I think this is obviously our history, the present moment, and all the problems with white supremacy that we're experiencing on a global scale right now. It's not like an accident, it's obviously tied to history. And so making those things available, publishing them, having it something that's not just a side story, but rather, something that can sustain attention and people can read on their own and have their own reactions, I think is also another important part.
I will just add that for me, it also connects to an issue of positionality, right? Being a Black peninsularist, takes on its own kind of levels of violence and racism within the field. And so there came a point where, in writing the book and having to keep reading play after play in which a Black man in particular was killed, where I recognized that this needed to be written, which is why I wrote it. But then I recognized that I had to leave that alone, right? And so this second project, and in the conclusion of the book, I talk a little bit about that. Like, I wanted to talk about life. I was tired of looking at dead Black bodies. And that's not what I want to spend my career doing. And at the same time, recognizing that as a Black male peninsularist and going into theaters and film archives and so much, that I'm already read a certain way, whether it's in the US or the UK or in Spain or what have you, that on it adds an extra level. But for me, it adds a level of importance, right? This work needs to be done to show that people such as myself can be in these spaces and deserve to be in these spaces, and that these stories must be told.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to jump to a question that's also for the three of you. This is from Susan Larson, and I read, Meira, Larissa, Jeffrey, thank you so much for these remarkably insightful presentations. I will go back and reconsider my syllabi for the coming semester, thinking about how to better, as Jeffrey put it, decentralize notions of who is Spanish. You have given us a lot to think about. I would like to hear more about the pedagogical responsibilities we have to our students as we move our teaching in this direction during our current historical moment.
I could start.
Thank you.
Something that I've grappled with a little bit. I think that, not everyone does critical race studies, and that's okay. I don't have the expectation that everyone's going to become the next Henry Louis Gates or Stuart Hall. That's fine. What I do think we need to do is figure out how can we start to have these conversations in our classroom with our students, right? So most peninsularists have to teach, for example, Lazarillo de Tormes, a text like that can be taught in a way in which you bring up race. There are racialized characters in that text. Even going back further and looking at Milagros de Nuestra Senora and how, Jewish people are represented. There's tons of colonial text, obviously. And then as you move through your syllabi, if there's really no room for it or no excuse for it not to have the discussion, in the same way that you can't teach a peninsular survey anymore and not talk about female authors or not bring in some reference to queer theory or queer identities. I think, we just have to say that this is a given, right? And if we as a field want to advance and want to remain relevant in the United States, you can't continue to not talk about racialized communities.
Thank you. Thank you. Meira, Larissa?
Well, I'll go next. I don't know. I'm breaking the order of things. I'm decentering the order. I mean, I don't teach literature. I teach dance. And what I do when I teach history, so I teach history of ballet, for example. And history of ballet, basically begins at the court of Louis XIV. So, the first ballet that I teach is ballet from 1653, where Louis XIV is playing the rising sun, and it's a political statement about absolute monarchy. And what I always do is, before I introduce that ballet, is I show the Carter's music video, Everything is Love, which is filmed in the Louvre, which was Louis XIV's palace. And it's just a critical commentary on all of these standards of beauty and uprightness and which part of your body is supposed to move and how are you supposed to move and what is virtue and what is, sinfulness, et cetera, et cetera. And it really, kind of back to your first question, Eva, is a way of making students really understand at a level that they already understand very well, because this is their language and this is their culture, how much Black culture has triumphed and shaped our, what we think of as American, I don't like to, US culture, whatever you want to call it, right? So yeah, that's what I do.
So I'll add, I think because many of the things that I teach are colonial in focus, they have content that is, racialized. It's not like it's, we're only reading epic poems in which only white subjects are there or something like that. But pedagogically, I ask my students to not just assume they know what those categories mean, and I remind them that these texts were produced in a period in which precisely what they mean is being worked out. And so I ask them, instead of assuming what, if it says blanco, that we know what that means, like what web of associations in the way that appears in that document creates that meaning? What does that mean? What, activates that particular reading in that context? And so I pedagogically like to, think about that period and think critically about the period, because I think once we focus on that moment and on fashioning, as part of why the early modern period is so interesting to me, is to really see that at one period of time, many different associations can be circulating. And so we need to think critically, not only about the past, but also that in the present, that white supremacy does not eclipse other means of considering a racialization. And there's also competing ways in which white supremacy is articulated. And all of these nuances deserve to be, especially from a humanistic perspective, really explored. So that's the other thing. And then when I don't have something and I'm teaching, I often revert to a different genre. I'll look for an image, or I'll look for, a different sort of a counterpoint. I think that's sort of similar to Meida's, when you're teaching one thing and sometimes the text itself really doesn't lend it to opening up the conversation, I'll look for something else that can help us ask interesting questions that wouldn't otherwise appear.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you. And fantastic questions and answers. Likewise. So this question is for Meira from Lourdes Davila. Wonderful presentation. I am impressed by your knowledge of your knowledgeable use of specific gestures to study history and its traces. Your work is absolutely necessary to point out, as you say, the resonant sound chambers in which the past is imminent. In what ways would the bodily archive that performs the pellizco today differ from a regular archive? And in parentheses, she says, I'm thinking here specifically of the archive as a construction that controls that which it takes, that takes and erases, modifies, catalogs. How important do you feel the rate and time of change in the body that learns and performs these gestures is in your study? Are we able to trace possible modifications of the gesture and rhythm across time?
Yeah, so thank you so much. That's an amazing question. And I'll try not to monopolize all the time, but just to say, and I think this relates back to the earlier question about pedagogy, right? So, you know, one of the things I always have my students do is ask their elders what they say and what they know. And all of those bodies of knowledge are there. Like, you know, flamenco dancers know, you know, exactly who that step comes from, you know, who that person's, you know, influences were. I mean, I'm very old and I've been dancing flamenco all my life since I was 15 years old, and I've seen change. I know, you know, kind of what has evolved and what has stayed the same over the time that I've been involved with flamenco. So I really, you know, what I really am working on now is to say, you know, everybody will say to you, you can't find any traces of the dancing body because it's gone. And they'll say, you know, you can move your hips, you know, in, you know, Turkey and in Norway. And, you know, it's like how the body only has so many ways of moving. How can you trace a gesture back in time? But, you know, what I'm working on is to build a case, right? To say, you know, look, we have in the archive, we have these verses, we have these lyrics, and the verses have structure, and scholars have studied them, and we know, you know, how they operate. And so, you know, for me, the way I sort of have been working on this, I think, like you, Larissa, in a way, is that I'm kind of reading two things at the same time. Like I'm always kind of in my flamenco world, and then I'm really reading really deeply into medieval Iberia. And so like one day I was like listening to a flamenco song and I was like, oh my God, that's a hacha. You know, it's like, I hadn't, and once I realized that, then you sort of start to see these traces. And I think they're everywhere. And I think it's just a matter of like putting, you know, just putting one foot in front of the other and doing your best to build an argument, which will never be conclusive because the body, you know, records and all of those things are there, but they're not written down in the past. But there are, and the other thing I'll just say really, really quickly is that another thing I've been doing is I've been studying early modern Spanish dance. And there are experts who work with those texts and those manuals and kind of with what we have today and counter-reference that. So again, that's a situation where, you know, I can study with practitioners, and that's where I think the real knowledge is, or very useful knowledge is.
Thank you, Meira. And this next question is for Jeffrey from Victor Sierra Matute. You mentioned Silvia Albert Zopal's second play, Blackface y otras vergüenzas, and I just wanted to ask you about the practice of blackface in Spain. Specifically, I was wondering if you could comment on the Three Kings Parade and the polemical tradition of choosing white persons in blackface to play the character of King Baltasar. Some people were hesitant to reevaluate this tradition. Is this nostalgia somehow related to what you mentioned about the brand Conguitos? Thank you.
Yeah. Gracias, Victor. I definitely think they're related. I think a lot of the practices around Black bodies connect to this idea of Spain's grandeur and, you know, formal imperial practices. And in the case of the Three Kings Day and Rey Baltasar, I know the case of Madrid the best, but for years it was a white person in blackface who would be as the Rey Baltasar. And actually one of the groups I mentioned in the talk, the Black View, which is an artist and actor collective, they petitioned the mayor of Madrid to put a Black actor. If we're going to understand collectively that Baltasar is Black, according to the legend, then at least use a Black person, right? And I think that's a very simple request, and it was granted. And so for the past, definitely in 2020, and I believe 2019 was the first time that a Black person was the Rey Baltasar. And so I find that to be a particularly powerful moment because similar things are happening in other countries with Zwarte Piet in the Netherlands there have been massive protests for the past few years there. In other parts of Spain, even with La Negra Tomasa, the celebrations in Alcoy in Valencia that are, I would say, borderline triggering in terms of the amount of blackface and public display of it. And that the town of Alcoy is trying to get the celebration to be part of the UNESCO patrimony. And so the idea that blackface could be a national patrimony or global patrimony, there's a lot to be said there. But it definitely connects to what we're seeing with conguitos, colacao, and things at a more micro level, right? That there's this resistance to let go of what we understood Spain to be, or this time in which Spaniards did not have to account for or reckon with their use of language and use of iconography.
Thank you so much. And just interrupt me if anybody wants to contribute anything else, but I have another question for the three of you. This question is from Jordana Mendelson, our very own, from NYU. I wonder if the panelists could speak further to the ideas presented in their talks related to embodiment, translation, transportation, such as literal across bodies of water and figurative in terms of changes of states of being, and questions of Blackness in the Iberian and Iberian Atlantic world. So she's asking about the embodiment, translation, transportation, literal across bodies of water, and figurative in terms of changes of states of being, and questions of Blackness in the Iberian Atlantic world.
Larissa, do you want to go first?
Sure, so the materials I'm dealing with, it has a tension where there is Blackness that's being forged through displacement and through the Middle Passage and the enslavement. And then there are people who stay in Cartagena and become of the city. And the fact that the city of Cartagena and the area around Cartagena, and the same thing goes for Lima, become cities in which a part of the urban population, a majority of the urban population is Black. And so there's a tension of this notion of, Jeffrey, in your talk, you talked about not being able to be from there, or never being able to give that, get rid of that. There's a certain point in the mid 17th century in both Lima and Cartagena when that's not the case, at least for that century, in which people are of, the idea of being a criollo, a negro or negra criolla, meant that you were of that region. And so there's that interesting tension where there's the process of transformation and the idea that when you come, Sandoval mentions the different ethnonyms that these different peoples come from, and they're only to him important insofar as they relate to what language the individual might speak or languages, and so that the appropriate interpreter can be found for them. But then afterwards, it seems the archive and the traces forget or don't have any more importance of those places of origin, and then it becomes a kind of a category that's really a large umbrella category of Blackness. And that part of the story of the 17th century is that transformation when people come being Lukumi or Nalu or Bran or Biafra, and then they become Black in that process of arrival and then and permanence. And I think that there's interesting ways in which people call themselves sometimes morenas or negras, and then also mention that they're Angolanas, or in the case of Andrés Sacabuche, he's described as a negro Ladino, but he specifies always that he's from Angola. And so these documents in which you see those two coexisting are really interesting to me, partly because they let us see that one transformation or that process doesn't occlude the coexistence of these other ways of defining. The archival documents oftentimes, whichever one's most convenient to mention is the one that gets written down, but it doesn't mean that it has to be the only one that was at work. So that's one of the ways I can address Jordana's question.
Can I go next, Jeffrey? Okay, so I'll just say really quickly that, you know, when you're talking about the estribillo, or if you're talking about the gesture, those are portable fragments that do get passed along and, you know, from generation to generation. And we can trace those back, you know, we can trace the seguidilla back, that verse form back, that structure of the verse. And so, you know, the question I'm asking myself, and again, I think this relates back to your first question, Eva, how do you teach this stuff, right? In ways that are not crushing, is I'm just kind of wondering about this use of parody, you know, I read Houston Baker Jr. is like a really important influence for me from a long time ago when I was writing my doctoral dissertation. And he talks about like deforming the mastery from within and sort of performative practice as mutating and transmuting what gets performed. And when something gets performed that has multiple levels, that speaks at multiple levels, and when you're actually in flamenco, we really are opposed to our surface. You know, we very often, you know, say something that's like gets you like this, and at the same time is completely opposing and critiquing the performative surface. So that's where I'm asking about this idea of contrafacta, which is something that we imitate in order to make fun of someone. You imitate them, and then you end up absorbing, you know, those fragments and those pieces, and they become incorporated into the culture. So I'm just kind of, that's what I'm thinking about in terms of, yeah.
I think for me, in the play specifically, one of the things that's really interesting is that there's a character that is a wig. And Sylvia Albert deals with the politics of Black hair and how as a child she used to straighten her hair through her adolescence because that was a way for her to fit in, even though she never really did as a Black woman. And at a certain point in her adulthood, she gets rid of the wig, and the wig becomes like the devil on her shoulder that talks to her, and that represents kind of internalized racism. And so at a certain point, she's able to get rid of the wig or cast it aside and become her true self. And so I think if we think through the politics of hair, particularly for Black women, that's something that shifts over time. And then the other piece of it that I think is super important is this idea of hyphenated identities. And so if we think back to the 80s and 90s when Black people were arriving to Spain en masse, we only talked about them as, oh, they're from Nigeria, oh, they're from Equatorial Guinea, etc. And now we have this emergence of the Afro-Espanol, the Afro-Basque, the Afro-Catalan. And connecting to what Larissa said, those people might still refer to the homeland of their parents and say, yes, I am Afro-Catalana, but my parents are from Senegal, right? And so there's still a reverence for the elders in that way. But there's a creation of a new identity that better encapsulates who these people are, right? They are not Senegalese or Nigerian or what have you. They are Bascos y Catalanes y Gallegos, and we have to recognize that, but also incorporate this idea of their Blackness.
Absolutely. Thank you. And yes, and learn how to speak about this Blackness. And also, thank you, Meira, for jumping us to the first question really quickly. I wanted to say that violence, even though it is difficult, we do need to sit with it in that discomfort, right? And it's not, and I think that what you are all dealing with are these archives that are incredibly violent, and you show why we need to sit with that discomfort and learn how to speak about it, and not try to make that a safe or comforting moment necessarily for the student, the reader, but to be different, right, with those archives so that we can tell these stories that will impact the future for our field and otherwise. So I think we're going to close it here. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to pass it back to Rafael.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. So I would like to thank Jordana and Laura for putting up together El Taller. Thank you, Alejandra Navarro, as well. Of course, thank you to our speakers, to Jeffrey, to Larissa, to Meira and Eva. Thank you also to, of course, everything runs smooth, but there is people working hard on tech behind the scenes. So thank you very much to Shari doing the captions and to Isabel. And thank you for this wonderful afternoon. I think we're discussing so much important things for these challenging times. And I think it's this kind of reflections certainly empower us to keep in the good fight and also knowing how to move ahead. Okay, so thank you so much. That's it for today. Thank you.
Thank you.